Welcome back to This Week in Immigration, and Happy New Year. I'm Rachel Iacono. On this week's program, we kick off 2021 with This Week regular Theresa Cardinal Brown hosting a special conversation with BPC Fellow Ruth Wasem. We will begin the episode with a brief discussion of the violent efforts to disrupt the certification of the Electoral College vote last week. Later, the two immigration experts will provide a rundown of recent midnight actions that President Trump has taken in the final few weeks of his administration. With the results of the Georgia runoffs giving Democrats a slim majority in the Senate and President-elect Biden's inauguration on January 20th, they will then turn to discussing administrative and legislative options Biden may take to undo such actions during the first months of his presidency. More of that to come, so stick around.
And we're back. This is Theresa Brown, and I'm happy to be here with Ruth Wasem, our BPC Fellow on Immigration and a professor of policy practice at the LBJ School of Public Policy at University of Texas, Austin. Welcome back, Ruth.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you again this week on the podcast.
Thanks so much. So we let our listeners know that we had postponed this recording, which we were supposed to record last Wednesday, due to the activities, if you will, that happened in Congress on January 6th. And I think that that's where we're going to start. Ruth, you worked at the Congressional Research Service for a very long time. You spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. Can you just share with our listeners a little bit of your reaction to watching what happened with the Capitol being broken into, with the attempts to disrupt the certification of the Electoral College results? What were some of your initial thoughts?
My initial thoughts were disbelief. I had a hard time fully comprehending what was happening. I had been preparing for this podcast and my phone rang. It was my brother in Ohio. He said, "Are you watching this?" "No, I'm working." And when I turned the TV, and I thought my brother was exaggerating, to be honest. I turned the TV on. I couldn't believe it. And as time wore on, it became more and more disturbing. The Capitol building and that whole Capitol complex is it's got so much symbolism, so much history, and it's always been a safe place and has places where people of differing opinions meet and convene and discuss. So that it's never been invaded before like that. So again, my initial thoughts were quite unnerved. A good friend of mine, I know Capitol Hill Police. They greeted me every morning when I arrived for work for over 25 years and said goodbye to me every evening when I left. They were just part of the work family of all of us that worked on the Hill. I found that one of them that I know quite well, I got word pretty early on that he was beaten with a baseball bat, which just broke my heart and shocked me. When I saw the photo of the officer who was killed, I recognized him immediately as someone I had frequently greeted on a regular basis. It was just part of the normal daily life. And as more and more of the footage comes out from various cell phones and wherever they're all coming from, I just get more and more distressed. I'm still processing it. I think I speak for many people who are still stunned. And we just never thought something like this could happen.
Yeah.
And there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot more to learn. That'll come out in the investigations, but it was a very, very dark day for our nation. And many of my colleagues that had worked on the Hill that were, are still there said it reminded them very much of how they felt on 9/11.
Yeah. I know for me, I was far from the scene. I live in Northern Virginia. I wasn't on Capitol Hill, but I was watching TV as it all transpired. And I told my family as well, the last time I felt this sort of shock and uncertainty of what happens next was those days after 9/11. And, the major difference there is that was, foreign terrorists who came to the United States to perpetrate that. And these were our own country people. And that was a bit of a shock. Congress did come back later that day and did finally certify the election. So we know that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be sworn in on the 20th as president and vice president-elect. But, we're seeing some of the ramifications of that continue to play out in Congress. Rachel talked in her opening about, that Democrats will have nominally control of the House and the Senate and the White House after the 20th. But what's your sense of how this is going to impact Congress's ability to actually do its work in the coming year and get along from the parties? You have members that were opposing the election results. You have members who were speaking at the rally before they came to the Capitol. It seems like there's a lot of personal distrust, if you will, in Congress. What's your sense of where that might go?
While there will be some distrust, I think that's going to be of a smaller group of people than that might not be. And one of the things that I've been thinking about that it could have an effect, particularly on immigration, is that the rhetoric, I think, for most members is going to be turned down a notch or two. Vitriol, where of making bold statements about minorities or immigrants, the kinds of things that kind of fed the fire that we saw. I think there's going to be more caution, more restraint in the rhetoric for most members of Congress. I'm not going to try to divine what some of the more extreme members are going to do, but I think you saw a lot of members much more sober, much more restrained, I think that they will be more cautious. I think that there also could be, again, people are talking a lot about healing. One of the ways that's more than just talking about healing is actually demonstrating it by working together. And when you think, well, what are the areas where Congress can work together across the aisle? And historically, I see at least two. I see infrastructure and I see immigration.
Oh, great.
As areas, and there could be more, but those are the two that I think are ones where you have elements in both parties that have already worked together in the past. Maybe it's the more distant past, but there is a tradition of working together. And so I would like to hope that there will be an extra effort that members will take to do some of these some legislative action that's collaborative and across party lines.
Yeah, I hope you're right on that. We know that the Biden folks during the campaign had promised to introduce legislation on day one. Kamala Harris did an interview with a Spanish language outlet this week talking about what might be in that. Of course, we're talking about legalization, includes prospects for the Dreamers. It includes, she said, changes to find more efficiencies in the legal immigration system to make it easier and a shorter pathway to get to citizenship. We haven't seen details of this. We don't know what all's in it. But what do you think? Do you think that this incoming administration is going to make an effort to try to move that in a bipartisan way?
I think they're going to try. Yeah. I don't know how successful it'll be, but I think they will try to, at least kick things off. And I've been thinking a lot about what would be a more streamlined, targeted way to approach some major chunks of what we know is a systemic set of problems in immigration.
Yeah.
And some of what Senator Harris, soon to be Vice President Harris, mentioned, you could argue are low hanging fruit, such as the DACA/Dreamers. That legislation has often, it's started. It was originally introduced by Orrin Hatch, a Republican, so it has a long tradition that way. I think agricultural workers, which is another one that was mentioned, the H-2A adjustments. That is one, again, with bipartisan support. She didn't mention it in her interview that I heard, as I read the transcript, but I think essential workers that are undocumented, like meat packing or in healthcare, home health aides, things like that, it wouldn't surprise me if they ended up on the list. So whether they'll introduce something that's as sweeping as what Biden had said earlier, which was a straight up legalization of 11 million people, or whether they'll identify particular populations where they can build a consensus. That's where we'll kind of see how this works out. Now, we also know that the Progressive Caucus has put together what they consider to be the essential ingredients in immigration legislation. Mm-hmm. What they're saying that sounds different than what I remember from when you and I were involved when they were negotiating comprehensive immigration reform, which literally had everything imaginable in it. Because the thought, rightly so, was that you change one thing and there's ramifications for something else. There's a logic for that. But if you look at what the progressives are saying now isn't an insistence on a comprehensive bill. What I hear them saying is that they're going to look at what gets introduced and acted on and then use their proposal as a standard of comparison. So it'll be the measuring stick rather than a stick that they use to
attack the other side. To stop legislation.
If that's the way, if it's something that where people are open to doing a series of immigration bills, then that may be the only way to get it done even though it could take time. And these are always political calculations. I know our listeners are aware that this isn't just on the merits of the policy. It's often on the practicality of the politics.
Well, speaking of the practicality and the politics, when we first said we would record this show, we didn't know the outcome of the elections in Georgia. We didn't know the control of the Senate. We did know that after November, the Democratic majority in the House was much narrower. And now we are looking at the possibility of a 50-50 Senate. So when we say that Democrats, if you will, have control of the Senate, they have control of the Senate by virtue of the fact that the vice president has a tie-breaking vote. But in day-to-day matters, they have 50 votes that they can work with. And that means to me that it's not so easy to push forward. You can't lose any votes of your own caucus if you're trying to push forward a partisan bill. And the easier path to legislating may actually be to try to find those ways you can work across the aisle in probably the House and the Senate. And I think you've talked about some of those things that might be getting bipartisan support. So I do think, but the other thing you said is it's difficult. And I think it's difficult even if you have majorities. It's more difficult when you have slim majorities, finding those ways. I think that the Biden administration, people have said they want to try to do things on a bipartisan basis. They want to try to work with Congress. But that's proven difficult for presidents of both parties on this issue. So I think what I want to turn to next is looking at those things that the Biden administration may do without Congress, right? So we know that the Trump administration did an awful lot by executive action, all kinds of executive actions, everything from, the big fancy presidential proclamations and executive orders to USCIS policy memos and regulations and everything in between. And they're still doing regulations. I mean, I have a short list of the things that they have done just since the election. They have made policy changes on the discretion that adjudicators at USCIS have in approving adjustment of status, making a higher level of discretion to deny adjustment of status. They've revised the naturalization test. They have required interviews for refugees and asylees who are sponsoring family members. They are re-adjudicating somebody's permanent resident status when they apply for naturalization. They will deny naturalization during removal proceedings, ending employment authorization documents for people who are under an order of supervision, awaiting whether or not they're going to be deported. They finalized a very large asylum regulation that had been enjoined by courts in its interim final stage. They finalized an asylum transit ban that also had been enjoined by a court. They finalized the asylum cooperation agreements with El Salvador and Honduras, extending the non-immigrant and immigrant visa bans by proclamation. I mean, I have more I could go through, but this is all just since the election. Let's start with these executive actions, all at the end of the administration. There is action that Congress could take with regard to these, something called the Congressional Review Act. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what authorities it gives Congress and maybe how it's been used?
Well, the Congressional Review Act was grows out of the Contract with America and Newt Gingrich. And so think of it as coming out of that, there are too many federal regulations. And so the thinking behind it was giving Congress a role in reviewing regulations and stopping the ones they don't like. And so it put in place where an executive branch notifies Congress, and Congress can vote to stop, to negate basically a regulation as if it never happened. And it sets up that once Congress does that, you can't reissue that regulation or a regulation on that particular topic. Now, in the early years, it wasn't used at all. So when you switched from, and when you think about it, when it would be likely to be used is in a moment just like we're in. Mm-hmm. When you're changing administrations from presidential administrations from one party to another, and when the legislature, the Congress goes from one party to another. When George W. Bush became president and had a Republican-controlled Congress, they only used the Congressional Review Act once to overturn a Clinton administration regulation. To my knowledge, the Obama Congress didn't do it to any of the Bush regulations, but when Donald Trump became president and the Republicans had both chambers, they passed, and I've seen two different numbers, either 14 or 16. So yeah, well over a dozen resolutions that repealed Obama administration rules. Bear in mind that much like what the Trump administration has been doing, issuing a lot of regulations, so too at the very end of the Obama administration, seeing what was lying on the horizon, they did a lot of last minute regs, putting things into place. And so Congress has when it's a new Congress, they say it's like hitting a reset button. Mm-hmm. So there's normally a 60-day period after a regulation's been promulgated for Congress to vote. With a new Congress, they do that. They start the clock again. So it goes back this time. I believe the date is August 21st, 2020. As you said, there have been a lot of regulations that have been issued during that period, covering a range of very important immigration topics. Mm-hmm. The difference is, and I've looked at some of them, and I think, again, this is something that Congress should take a look at, but be cautious. Take a good look at what they want to do. There's a lot. If it's not a regulation, if it's an executive order or proclamation, that's something generally that an administration can change, issue a new one. Now, we found out with DACA, when Trump tried to roll back DACA, you have to follow the Administrative Procedures Act. And so it's not just that Biden can come in and say, I'm going to issue all these new things, because courts have since ruled on that because of some of the things that the Trump administration did. The Biden administration, if they try to do this through executive action, will have to be, dot every I and cross every T. Similarly, Congress needs to take a good look at these regulations if they're going to use the Congressional Review Act. And I think they should. I think they should consider the Congressional Review Act on all of them, at least consider it. Take a look and see what would be the ramifications if they pulled it. And then, because as most people know, rewriting a regulation and going through the proposal and promulgation process is very, very labor intensive, time consuming, and it's really a heavy lift. And so, from an elegance point of view, having Congress do it and just do it is the most efficient, but it may have unintended consequences.
Well, let's talk about that, because one of the consequences of the Review Act, if Congress strikes down a regulation, it limits not just the current administration, but any future administration in how they regulate in that area. So I think one of the things that you're suggesting is that the Biden administration may want to see, is this an area we may want to write a different rule? And would that rule be substantially similar to what Congress has undone? So, going through some of the rules, and I think for our listeners, you said the date is August 21st, 2020. Any rule that was finalized after that date or went into effect after that date. For many of our listeners who are very concerned about the public charge regulation, that does not fall within this window. So Congressional Review Act would not be able to be used on the public charge regulation. But as you mentioned, many of the asylum regulations, changes to the H-1B program, to prevailing wages that have been finalized, some of these rules regarding how the immigration courts function or who gets EADs, all of those theoretically could be subject to Congressional Review Act. If the Biden administration is limited in some of that, what they want Congress to do, you mentioned that the other way is that they promulgate a new rule.
Or there's a third way.
What's the third way?
Well, if you know it's an area where you think you're going to legislate, let's use the asylum regulations in the courts. And if you think that there's a great likelihood that Congress will also be doing asylum reform and tackling that, then that would be a different law that the administration would be regulating on. So
it would make the previous regulation essentially moot.
It could, depending on how it's drafted. So thinking about it in terms of, that's why I say these things should be considered, but think about it strategically and over a sequence of things, so that if you say we are going to stop all of the asylum regulations and what has and the stuff with the courts, it's just we're going to stop them. Think about what legislation you would introduce that would and would be likely to pass, that would enable, whether it's the Biden administration or any future administrations, to then do implementing regulations.
So a different set of regulations for a new law could overtake some of these past ones. Got it. Got it. What about the court cases? I mean, this is something that I've heard a lot of. A lot of these regulations are in various stages of being litigated in various courts around the country. Many of those cases are not concluded. And so the Biden administration essentially will inherit the responsibility of whether or not to defend those cases, those previous regulations in court under a new attorney general and a new DOJ, or settle, or let the court rule against them. That could be a way also of sort of ending previous regulation that would give a new administration relatively wide open space to re-regulate in that area. Is that correct?
Yes. And the trick with the courts is if you just drop it, then the regs are still on the books to be used by somebody in the future to challenge in court. So if you do want to get some resolution, if you think that the courts are going to rule in your favor,
or in this case, rule against the Trump regulation.
Rule against, yes.
if that's what the Biden administration
regulations, yeah. And so that again is a calculated strategic decision that is not carte blanche. It should be done on a literally case-by-case basis.
Well, we have a new incoming attorney general who will have oversight over the immigration courts, as well as those cases that come before the immigration courts, as well as deciding what to do with these immigration cases. So I think many of us who kind of came in immigration during the DHS era didn't necessarily see DOJ as the key player anymore, but certainly under the Trump administration, we know how powerful the Department of Justice is in immigration. Sounds like we're still going to have to look at what the new attorney general is going to do, as well as what DHS is going to want to do under a new administration. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your insight, as always, on all of these issues. We look forward to having you again to talk to us about Congress, about regulations, about history, and helping us to understand this stuff. Thanks so much for joining us.
I've enjoyed it very much, Theresa. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
That's it for today's show. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show today at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. Theresa is on Twitter at BPC_T Brown, and Ruth is also on Twitter at RE Wasem. I'm Rachel Yakino. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Yafet Tawahara produces and edits our show. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.